Hello, and welcome back to this training series on FEMA P-1000, Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety. You're watching Module 6, Funding Support and Other Resources for Advancing School Natural Hazard Safety. This is the last of 6 training videos that are outlined here. Module 1 was an introduction to FEMA P-1000. Module 2 reviewed identifying relevant natural hazards and making school buildings safer. Module 3 provided guidance on planning school emergency responses and disaster recovery. Module 4 touched on engaging the whole community, and Module 5 discussed the supplemental technical guidance in FEMA P-1000. In this final training video, Module 6, both Lori and Barry will review some funding resources for improving natural hazard safety. With that, Lori, let's get started.
Thank you, Gigi, so much. It's great to be here today. So as Gigi mentioned, the 6th and final module in this series focuses on funding resources. And our primary focus will be on developing a funding plan, finding funding resources that are already available, and also talking about other forms of support that might be necessary to move forward, such as finding technical assistance to develop a plan. So in order to develop a funding plan, it's important to recognize that the scope of the plan, as well as the cost, will determine how much support the school will need to seek and receive. So consider that some of the things that we've been talking about throughout this series, such as running a tabletop or having semi-annual drills, may actually be relatively low-cost interventions. But in this section of the guide, we're really talking more about higher cost infrastructure related changes that schools oftentimes may be needing to work on, such as building a tornado safe room or elevating a school in a flood zone. So if you have such a project that would require the development of a comprehensive funding plan, we recommend starting by reaching out to your local state hazard mitigation officer, also fondly known as your SHMO. They are a great resource to obtain information about federally funded projects, so what's available from FEMA or other government agencies. They can also help you to work through potential cost share requirements, as well as cost estimates for various projects that the school or school district might be considering. In order to develop a funding plan, there are actually several common ways to raise needed funds for school building projects. These include engaging in special fundraising campaigns online or through the community. For example, after the deadly 2013 Moore, Oklahoma tornado, the governor called for the opening of a fundraising campaign where private as well as individual donors could make contributions to try to build tornado safe rooms in schools as well as in local communities. So sometimes before, or in the case of many communities after a disaster, they run special fundraising campaigns. Another way to raise needed funds is through public-private partnerships between schools and companies or corporations that may have technical expertise or access to construction materials or other needed supplies to help move a school forward with a project. Another way that schools oftentimes move forward with raising needed funds is through school bond measures or other ballot initiatives. An example of this is after the 2011 Joplin tornado flattened 6 schools in the district, including completely destroying the high school where some 2,000 students attended. Joplin received over $100 million in insurance payouts, federal funding from FEMA, as well as from private donations. But even with that $100 million plus that was raised, it still was not enough for Joplin to fully recover given the amount of damage to the school buildings in their district. So just about 7 months after that deadly disaster, they put a $62 million bond measure forward. In the end, that bond measure only passed by about 1% of the necessary vote. And school leaders, when we were in the community afterwards, attributed the passage of that bond measure to the fact that many 18-year-olds and other young adults in the community voted because they had been affected firsthand by that disaster, and they knew how important it was to get the schools rebuilt. But the narrow passage rate of that bond measure speaks to how hard it can be, even after a deadly disaster, to get a measure like that through. And it also speaks to what Barry covered in an earlier module about the importance of the whole community and bringing people together to ensure that they are behind initiatives like this. And Joplin worked really hard to do that. And again, ultimately, that major bond initiative was passed thanks to bringing people together, even if only narrowly. In developing a funding plan for federal support, school districts should participate in the development of their local and hopefully state hazard mitigation plans. For those who are unaware, state hazard mitigation plans are actually required to be submitted to FEMA, and they must be updated and reapproved every 5 years for states to maintain their eligibility for grant funds. Note too that the US territories, as well as Washington, D.C., and tribal regions across the nation also write these mitigation plans, and they are vitally important for long-term planning, for hazard risk reduction. But in the case of schools, oftentimes if schools and school leaders aren't involved in the development of these plans, schools as vital infrastructure within the community may not be a central focus in the longer term mitigation planning. And so that's why it's really important to literally have a seat at the table to ensure that school leaders have a voice. So where to begin? In order to develop a funding plan, it's really important for school leaders to connect with other leaders like elected officials, members of the local business community, parents, and others who have a stake in having functioning schools within the community. By bringing people together like this, you never know what resources, connections, and ideas people might bring to the table that can help to advance the funding planning process. In addition, don't be scared to reach out to other communities in your state or region who you've heard may have developed a similar funding plan. Oftentimes, sharing these kinds of resources can really help to move the process forward. Why does a funding plan matter so much? So in part, it builds an understanding about the importance of obtaining funds for school natural hazard safety and for vital construction projects such as the development or retrofit of an at-risk school, or in the case of this image shown on the screen, sometimes it involves the construction of a new facility, such as the Beggs Event Center and Gymnasium in Oklahoma, which actually houses the Beggs School District's Tornado Safe Room. This is a domed building in the heart of Beggs that has a steel frame and walls of concrete that are 16 inches thick. Everyone in Beggs knows it is the safest spot in town, and it's the place to go if there is a tornado approaching. The former superintendent of schools there, Cindy Swearingen, said that this structure is built to withstand an F5 tornado. And it's, quote, our way of giving back to the community since they gave the building to us in a bond issue. It's our way of opening up and helping them feel safe and secure. We use this example in the guidebook because it's an example of the whole community coming together to develop a funding plan and also to really come together to figure out a structure that can serve multiple community needs. Community needs during non-disaster times, so that gymnasium and event center to bring the community together, but also a structure that can serve the community's needs in the event of a severe weather event such as a tornado. Financing the recovery. So in the event of a disaster, it is important to prioritize legal and financial record keeping. before the disaster occurs, and to ensure that those records are available in the event of an environmental extreme. Such records are needed for reimbursements and for possible legal reasons. But it's important to remember that the disruption caused by disaster can make it difficult to access these vital files so that school districts can move forward with requesting funding assistance from the federal government or working on insurance payouts. So planning to ensure that these records are backed up, stored offsite, and accessible is invaluable in terms of ensuring a successful recovery. And so to share a brief story about this and how important this kind of planning and focus on documentation really is. About 2 years after the Anchorage earthquake, which occurred in 2018, my research team and I visited Anchorage, Alaska. And at that point, we had the opportunity to meet with a wonderful consultant who'd been hired by the Anchorage schools to help manage the recovery because it was an incredible process. And one of the things that he emphasized was exactly this, that if Anchorage hadn't kept these meticulous records, they wouldn't be as positioned as they were to move forward in the recovery process. And mind you, while that Anchorage earthquake didn't receive a lot of attention because it didn't lead to large-scale loss of life, every single school building in the Anchorage School District, which is the largest district in the state of Alaska, every single school building received some damage in that earthquake. And so again, having that documentation at the ready so non-structural as well as structural damage could be addressed was absolutely vital. Donations and donations management is another really important part of the resource planning process for schools to really think about. And so donation management can actually become a large part of the financial recovery process. This is sometimes when these donations are monetary in nature, ensuring that the donations are, that there's a pathway for properly receiving donations when philanthropic donors or local residents or people from afar want to give. And so schools need to be ready to be able to accept those donations as well as material goods. And this is where having a clear communications plan in place can be really important, especially clearly articulating what schools do as well as what they do not need. This can help ensure that donated resources are useful. And so I've seen in many communities after a disaster where schools will move quickly to update their website. Sometimes they set up donations pages so that people can direct financial donations to the schools themselves. But in other instances, I've seen schools where they didn't clearly articulate what they did not need. And sometimes what happens in the aftermath of a disaster is that schools and communities are absolutely inundated with supplies that they may not need. And then managing those donations can become an incredible drain on the recovery process. And so again, making that clear articulation, what does the school need? When does it need it? And what is the purpose of whatever is being given can help donors to figure out where they most want to invest and to ensure that what they're giving is most useful to the schools and the school district. And so with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Barry so he can dive in a little bit deeper about some of the different policy guidance as well as funding mechanisms that are available specifically to schools. And so Barry, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lori. I really appreciate the personal stories that you told connected with the funding and your experience in Alaska in particular. So let's get started by reviewing some of the federal funding opportunities that are available. The Stafford Act, which authorizes delivery of federal technical, financial, logistical, and other assistance to states and localities during declared major disasters and emergency, is the basis for most of the federal funds that we're going to be talking about. The local government maintains control of all the assets used in the response and recovery efforts, regardless of the source of those assets. FEMA provides the resources, but does not coordinate them. The local governments do that. So this is a graph that shows the two basic kinds of hazard mitigation assistance programs that FEMA runs. On the left are the disaster cycle grant programs, and on the right are the annual grant programs. As you can imagine, the disaster cycle means these programs are available when a disaster occurs. So under those, we have the public assistance or PA mitigation, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program or HMGP, and the HMGP post-fire funding. On the annual side, we have the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, the Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC funding, and then the pre-disaster mitigation funding. So let's go through those briefly. The Public Assistance Program provides federal grants for debris removal, emergency protective measures, repairs, replacement, or restoration for publicly owned facilities and some not-for-profit institutions following emergencies declared, major disaster emergencies declared by the president. PA programs also provide assistance for hazard mitigation measures during recovery process. The hazard mitigation, FEMA's hazard mitigation grant program provides funding for mitigation measures so that recipients can rebuild in ways that reduce or mitigate future natural hazard losses in communities. The Building Resilience Infrastructure, and I like to say infrastructure communities, or BRIC program is a new program that didn't exist when we wrote our guidebook. And so this is a great program that's done a lot of things that we'll see have become commonplace now. So the BRIC program aims to categorically shift the federal focus away from reactive disaster spending and toward resource-supported, proactive investments in community resilience. Examples of BRIC programs are ones that demonstrate innovative approaches to partnerships, such as shared funding mechanisms and/or project design. An example of that might be an innovative project may bring multiple funding sources or in-kind resources from a range of private and public sector partners, or an innovative project may offer multiple benefits to a community in addition to the benefit of risk reduction. We saw this as an example in the Beggs, Oklahoma Event Center that Lori spoke to earlier. Through BRIC, FEMA continues to invest in a variety of mitigation activities with an added focus on infrastructure projects benefiting disadvantaged communities, nature-based solutions, climate resilience and adaptation, and adopting hazard-resistant building codes. The guiding principles for BRIC are these. They want to support community and capacity building. They want to encourage and enable innovation. They want to promote partnerships. These things we've talked about in prior modules. They want to enable large infrastructure projects. They want to maintain some flexibility in how they provide funding, and they want to provide consistency in the way that they are funding hazard mitigation projects. As Laurie mentioned, there are eligibility considerations. Local school districts are generally eligible as sub-applicants. That means that you are a sub-applicant to your state hazard mitigation efforts. Private schools may be eligible under the HMGP and HMGP post-fire. The common thread is that all projects must demonstrate these three qualities. They must reduce the risk to life, safety, and property. They must have technical feasibility, and they must have cost effectiveness built into them. And as Laurie mentioned, a mitigation plan is one of those requirements. Private schools may not be eligible for FEMA's PA program or HMGP. However, the U.S. Small Business Administration might consider these schools for low-interest disaster loans for repairs or replacement of property or equipment during a declared disaster. So, what are some of the mitigation opportunities that we have for schools? Well, structure elevation. If your structure is in below a flood elevation, you might propose raising that structure to get it above that floodplain. There might be various flood risk reduction projects that you can envision to minimize the effects of flood damage to schools. Stabilizations projects, flood proofing, tsunami vertical evacuation centers, which we saw, it's one of the earlier modules. Community safe rooms, as we've spoken about, wildfire mitigation, and secondary power source requirements if you're going to use the facility for emergency sheltering. And then lastly, retrofitting. On the right, you can see a picture of the Puerto Rico damage that was done to schools following the 2020 earthquakes. In 2022, FEMA allocated $150 million to retrofit 55 of those schools on the island. Capacity building, and this is where we get into providing a pathway, if you will, for building the activities that need to come beforehand before you can do certain things in terms of making application for funding. One would be planning and planning related activities. Another would be project scoping or advanced assistance, partnerships that we've mentioned before, direct technical assistance, that's non-monetary assistance, where you are given direct technical assistance by FEMA to help you promote certain activities. And then codes and standards. This is where you try and improve the standards for construction in your communities. So those would be some of the exact examples of how the BRIC program would build capacity. Also interesting to note is the management costs, funding for administrative costs associated with the sub-application development and grants management activities. But this is only available if the project is awarded. So other considerations for this funding is cost sharing. HMA grants require a local contribution to the cost of the project, generally 25% local share, 75% federal. Some projects, such as those in low-income communities, may qualify for a reduced share of 10%. Check with your recipient agency if your state provides funding for the local share. How do you apply? All sub-applications, and this would be school districts who would be a sub-applicant to the state, who would be the primary applicant. You must first submit to your project to that state, local, tribal, or territorial agency. The recipients collect that and review the sub-application and then submit them all together to FEMA. Each recipient has its own deadlines and other requirements, and so you need to contact your hazard mitigation officer, and these links will bring you to places that you can find that. In wrapping up, these are some of the major resources that this module would like to promote: the 2023 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants Program, and the Public Assistance Program. Each of these guides walks you through very particularly how to go about the process. In addition to working with your SHMO, these are valuable resources. With that, I will turn it back to Gigi to see if there are questions you'd like to ask.
Great, thank you both so much. I do have a couple questions. So Lori, one of the barriers to advancing school safety has to do with concerns around funding. Do you have an example of a district that has successfully developed a funding plan to finance school mitigation or recovery activities?
Yes, thank you for asking that, Gigi. So I actually am going to give an example that was briefly covered on one of Barry's slides related to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was, of course, devastated by Hurricane Maria in 2017 with flooding, wind, as well as landslides across the island. And then in 2019, 2020, Puerto Ricans were again found their lives disrupted by a series of earthquakes that did quite a bit of damage to homes, businesses, as well as schools. And so over the past year, Puerto Rico has worked with the Federal Emergency Management Agency and has actually acquired over $200 million in funding, including some $35 million from the HMGP, or the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program that Barry described earlier, as well as $186 million from the Public Assistance Program to help to assess the seismic safety of schools on the island, schools that were not actually affected in that 2019-2020 earthquake sequence, but other schools in other regions of Puerto Rico that are a known risk to earthquakes as well as other hazards. And so I think that is an incredible example of a place really badly affected by disaster, but using those experiences and lessons learned in terms of engaging with the federal government and various federal funding programs to try to move forward with seismic as well as other forms of natural hazard safety. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lori. Barry, With so many funding resources, federal, state, private, available, how can they be identified and who might be best qualified to deal with this?
Yeah, great question. Where to look and who to ask, right? Yeah, there are a lot of funding resources that we've talked about here, and of course, there are school districts in general approach many of their projects by looking at local bonding. So that's a local funding opportunity. But as Laurie had mentioned, the state hazard mitigation officer is the primary contact point for understanding what other options federal programs that you could apply for. Here in Utah, for instance, we have recently promoted retrofit or replacement of unreinforced masonry schools. And our state hazard mitigation officer has been very instrumental in helping school districts put the pieces together to walk through the brick program by building their portfolio of projects that will be parlayed, hopefully, into funding in the future. So it is a big task. It is one that you want to say to yourself, you don't want to leave any rock unturned. You want to look for as many sources as possible. And of course, the BRIC program in particular is more than happy to bump you up on the list if you've also sought other funds and make your application more attractive. So it is some hard work. There are people that specialize in this, but the important point is to make sure that you are as thorough and as helpful as you can be in putting your proposals together for the public to understand that you've gone the extra mile to figure out the various funding sources that you might have for your project. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Barry and Lori, for such a great training series. This concludes the free training series on FEMA P-1000, Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety.